If you think money makes you untouchable, you've never spoken in front of the wrong room. The chandelier light inside the Manhattan Grand Regency Hotel shimmered like frozen fire as guests gathered for the annual Whitmore Business Gala. A night where reputations were polished and egos quietly shattered beneath polite smiles. Emily Carter stood near the edge of the marble hall, her presence calm, almost invisible to those who preferred loud success over quiet resilience. Across the room, Daniel Whitmore made sure he was not invisible at all. His laugh carried easily, confident and practiced, as he spoke to a cluster of investors about deals, acquisitions, and the kind of wealth he now believed defined his worth. Beside him, his new partner leaned in with admiration that felt rehearsed, reinforcing every word he said like applause that never stopped. Then his eyes found Emily. For a brief moment, his expression shifted, not with surprise, but with the familiar certainty of someone who believed the past could still be controlled. He excused himself from the group and crossed the room with slow intention, as if every step was part of a performance designed for an audience he had already claimed. "Emily Carter," he said when he reached her, his voice smooth, layered with something that resembled satisfaction. "I didn't expect you to make it tonight. Though I suppose curiosity is natural when you're watching people move forward." A few nearby conversations softened, attention subtly drifting toward them without anyone admitting it openly. Emily met his gaze without flinching. She wore no visible effort to impress, no need to compete with the sharp edges of his confidence. "I came because I was invited," she replied simply, her tone steady, unreadable. Daniel smiled as if that answer amused him. "Invited?" he repeated lightly, as though tasting the word. "That's generous. Not everyone gets to stay in the room after losing relevance." A quiet ripple of discomfort passed through the nearby guests, but no one intervened. This was the kind of exchange people pretended not to hear while remembering every word later. Daniel adjusted his cufflinks, the gesture deliberate, almost ceremonial. "You've always been resilient, Emily. I'll give you that. But resilience doesn't pay bills. It doesn't build empires. It just helps you survive what better people move beyond." The words were sharp but wrapped in the language of casual observation, designed to elevate him without appearing cruel. Emily's expression did not change, but something in the atmosphere around her seemed to settle, as if silence itself was acknowledging a shift no one could yet name. From across the hall, a different presence entered. It was not announced loudly, nor accompanied by spectacle, but the effect was immediate. Conversation softened further, attention redirecting without explanation. Alexander Reed moved through the room with calm precision, the kind of authority that did not need introduction. Daniel noticed it too late, his posture tightening slightly as recognition formed slowly in his expression. "That's Alexander Reed," someone whispered nearby, though it felt unnecessary. Daniel straightened, his earlier confidence adjusting into something more careful, rehearsed again for a different kind of audience. He offered a hand as Alexander approached, his voice shifting into professional ease. "Mr. Reed, it's an honor. I followed your recent expansion into East Coast investments closely. We share some aligned interests." Alexander's gaze did not immediately settle on the extended hand. Instead, it moved briefly toward Emily, as if confirming something only he understood. The silence between those few seconds carried more weight than Daniel's entire introduction. And in that silence, the balance of the room began to change without a single word being raised. The room had not yet recovered from the silence Alexander Reed's presence had created when Daniel Whitmore forced himself to reassemble his confidence. He straightened his posture, adjusted his cufflinks again, and let out a polite smile that looked carefully rehearsed. "Mr. Reed," Daniel said, his voice slightly more measured now, "it is a privilege to meet you in person. Your recent acquisitions have been quite impressive. I believe there are strong opportunities for collaboration between our firms." The words were smooth, practiced, designed to signal equality even in the presence of someone whose reputation dominated the room. Alexander did not respond immediately. Instead, he allowed a brief silence to stretch, not uncomfortable, but heavy enough to make Daniel aware of every passing second. His gaze remained steady, not on Daniel, but briefly shifting back toward Emily Carter as if confirming a detail only he understood. Emily stood still, her expression unchanged, though the atmosphere around her seemed subtly different now, as if she was no longer simply a guest in the room, but something the room had not yet fully recognized. Daniel noticed the glance but chose to ignore it, redirecting his attention with renewed confidence. "We have been expanding aggressively in the Northeast market," Daniel continued. "If you are considering strategic partners, I can assure you that my organization is well positioned to deliver strong returns." A few nearby attendees listened more closely now, sensing the possibility of a significant alliance forming in real time. Alexander finally shifted his attention fully to Daniel. His expression was calm, almost indifferent, but there was a quiet precision in the way he observed him, as if evaluating something far beyond business metrics. "Your organization," Alexander repeated slowly, as though testing the weight of the phrase. Daniel nodded, encouraged by the acknowledgement. "Yes. We have built substantial momentum over the past few years. We have also secured several key partnerships that ensure long-term stability." There was a brief pause before Alexander spoke again. "Interesting," he said simply. The word carried no approval, no disagreement, only distance. Daniel mistook it for openness and pressed forward. "If you are attending tonight with investment intentions, I would be glad to arrange a private discussion. My team is prepared to move quickly on high-value opportunities." For the first time, Alexander's gaze shifted fully away from Daniel and toward the wider room. The chandeliers reflected faintly in his eyes as he observed the gathering, the conversations, the quiet hierarchy of influence that most people believed they understood. Then his attention returned to Daniel, more direct this time. "Tell me," Alexander said evenly, "how familiar are you with the companies that provide your primary financing?" The question was simple, but it altered the air instantly. Daniel hesitated for the first time, though only briefly. "We work with several institutions," he replied carefully. "Private lenders, investment groups, standard capital channels." Alexander nodded slightly, as if confirming something. "And those institutions have never changed their terms unexpectedly?" Daniel smiled faintly, trying to maintain control of the conversation. "Not in any way that has affected our operations." Another pause followed, longer this time. In that silence, Emily remained still at the edge of the room, watching without interruption, her presence unnoticed by most but increasingly central in a way no one yet acknowledged. Alexander finally spoke again, his voice still calm, but now carrying a finality that subtly tightened the space between everyone listening. "That is because those institutions," he said, "do not operate independently of me." The words did not rise in volume, yet they landed across the room with undeniable weight. Daniel's expression did not collapse immediately, but something behind his eyes shifted, a quiet recalibration that refused to complete itself. The surrounding conversations faded further, as if the entire gala had been drawn into a single point of attention. Emily's gaze briefly met Alexander's, not with surprise, but with recognition that required no explanation. And for the first time that evening, Daniel Whitmore stopped speaking. The silence that followed Alexander Reed's statement did not feel empty. It felt occupied, as if the entire room had become aware of a hidden structure beneath everything it had assumed to be stable. Daniel Whitmore remained still for a moment, his expression carefully controlled, but the confidence he had carried earlier now appeared slightly delayed, as though it no longer responded to his intentions. "I see," Daniel finally said, his voice lower, attempting to recover composure. "Then I assume we are speaking in broader strategic terms. In that case, my firm has always maintained strong compliance and partnership history with all major capital networks." He forced a light smile, but it no longer carried the same ease. Alexander observed him without interruption, his expression unchanged, but his attention had sharpened in a way that did not require visible reaction. "Partnership history," Alexander repeated quietly. The phrase hung in the air, not as agreement or disagreement, but as a quiet examination of something Daniel had not realized was already being measured. Emily Carter remained at the edge of the gathering. She had not moved, yet her presence felt increasingly defined, as if the room was slowly recalibrating its understanding of where she stood within it. Some guests had begun to notice her not through introduction, but through implication, as if her stillness itself carried context that had not yet been spoken aloud. Daniel, however, remained focused on Alexander, attempting to regain conversational control. If there are concerns regarding financial alignment, Daniel continued, I would be more than willing to provide detailed documentation. We have nothing to hide, and our growth trajectory speaks for itself. Alexander tilted his head slightly, not in acknowledgement but in consideration. When he finally spoke, his tone remained even. Growth trajectories are often dependent on assumptions, he said. Assumptions about stability, access, and continuity. Daniel nodded quickly, interpreting the response as engagement. Exactly. And those assumptions have held firm across all our projections. A brief pause followed. Then Alexander's gaze shifted once more toward Daniel, and this time there was no ambiguity in the direction of his attention. Not all projections survive contact with structural ownership, Alexander said calmly. The words were simple, but their effect was immediate. Daniel's posture tightened subtly, though he still attempted to maintain composure. Structural ownership, he repeated. Yes, of course, we understand the importance of capital structure. Our advisory team regularly evaluates exposure across all tiers of investment. Alexander did not respond right away. Instead, he allowed the silence to settle again, not as hesitation, but as finality forming in real time. Emily's eyes moved briefly toward Alexander, then toward Daniel, but her expression remained unchanged, as if she had already reached the end of a conclusion others had not yet begun to understand. Your advisory team, Alexander said at last, would already know the answer to the question you are currently trying to avoid. Daniel's confidence faltered for the first time in a visible way. It was not dramatic, but it was undeniable. I am not sure I follow, he said carefully. Alexander's voice remained steady. You will. The single word landed without force, yet it carried the weight of certainty. The surrounding guests no longer pretended not to listen. Conversations had fully stopped now, replaced by a collective awareness that something fundamental was unfolding without spectacle. Daniel's gaze shifted briefly, as if searching for external validation from the room, but found none. Instead, he saw only observation. Alexander took a step to the side, not closing distance but repositioning perspective. All financial channels you rely on for liquidity, credit extension, and operational leverage, he said, are ultimately governed through frameworks under my oversight. The statement did not rise in volume. It did not require emphasis. It simply completed itself. Daniel's mouth opened slightly, but no immediate response followed. The structure of his certainty, carefully built over years, did not collapse in a moment of chaos. It simply lost coherence in silence. Emily remained where she stood, but now there was no longer ambiguity about her position in the room. She was not an observer of the exchange. She was the point around which it had always been moving. And for the first time since the evening began, Daniel Whitmore was no longer speaking because there was nothing left that his voice could stabilize. Daniel Whitmore stood still as the weight of Alexander Reed's words settled into the space around him, not like a sudden impact but like something slowly removing the ground beneath certainty. His expression remained composed, yet the effort to maintain it was now visible in the subtle tightening of his jaw and the slight delay before each breath. That is a very broad statement, Daniel said carefully, attempting to regain conversational footing. If you are implying total oversight of the financial institutions we work with, that would be highly unusual, even for someone of your influence. Alexander did not react immediately. His silence was not hesitation, but precision, as if he was allowing Daniel to hear the structure of his own misunderstanding. Emily Carter remained motionless near the edge of the room, but her stillness no longer felt passive. It felt deliberate, as though she was observing a moment she had already lived through in a different form. The guests around them no longer whispered. They listened openly now, their attention fully captured by the exchange that had moved beyond social interaction into something far more definitive. Alexander finally spoke, his tone unchanged. Unusual is often just another word for unnoticed systems of control, he said calmly. Daniel exhaled lightly, attempting a controlled smile. With respect, Mr. Reed, I think there may be some confusion regarding scale. Our firm operates across multiple states with diversified capital partners. No single entity would have that level of consolidated influence without regulatory exposure. Alexander's gaze shifted slightly, not away from Daniel, but through him, as if evaluating the logic rather than the person. Regulatory exposure assumes visibility, he replied. Not all structures exist in visible frameworks. The words did not carry threat or aggression. They carried certainty without effort. Daniel paused again, this time longer. For the first time, he glanced toward Emily, perhaps instinctively, as if seeking an anchor in a conversation that was no longer responding to his expectations. Emily did not react. Her expression remained calm, but her attention was fully present, not on Daniel, but on the unfolding alignment of truths he was only now beginning to approach. Alexander took a slow step forward, not closing distance but shifting presence. You referenced stability earlier, he said. Stability is not defined by growth or expansion. It is defined by who has the ability to withdraw support without disruption. Daniel's expression tightened slightly. Withdraw support, he repeated. Alexander nodded once. Exactly. The room seemed to contract around that word. Not physically, but perceptually, as if everyone present understood that the conversation had moved into territory where assumptions no longer held value. Daniel attempted to respond, but his voice was slightly less steady. If you are suggesting that my firm's financial continuity is dependent on external discretion, that would contradict every audit and compliance review we have undergone. Alexander's response was immediate, but still calm. Audits confirm alignment with what is disclosed, he said. They do not account for what is structurally positioned outside disclosure frameworks. A brief silence followed. It was not uncomfortable but absolute. Daniel's confidence, which had been carefully constructed through repetition and public reinforcement, now appeared misaligned with the environment around him. He adjusted his posture again, though the gesture lacked its earlier certainty. Even if what you are implying were accurate, Daniel said, it would still require operational transparency that could not exist at the scale you are describing. Alexander looked at him directly now. It already exists, he said simply. The simplicity of the statement carried more weight than any elaboration. Daniel did not respond immediately. For the first time, the space around him no longer felt like an audience validating his presence. It felt like an environment recalculating his position within it. Emily finally shifted her gaze slightly, not toward Daniel but toward Alexander, a subtle acknowledgement passing between them that required no verbal confirmation. Daniel noticed the shift, though he could not interpret it fully. Emily, he said, attempting to re-establish familiarity within a destabilized context, I assume you were aware of this arrangement. His tone was no longer confident. It was searching. Emily met his eyes briefly. Her voice when it came was calm and measured. You assumed many things, she said. It was not an accusation. It was a clarification. And in that moment, Daniel Whitmore understood that nothing in the room was responding to his assumptions anymore. The words Emily Carter spoke did not carry volume, but they changed the temperature of the room in a way no financial statement or corporate authority had managed to do. Daniel Whitmore stared at her for a moment, as if trying to locate the version of her he believed he had once understood. Assumed many things, he repeated slowly, attempting to anchor himself in logic rather than emotion. Emily, I did not assume without reason. There are facts about your current position that do not align with what I am hearing tonight. Emily did not respond immediately. Her silence was not uncertainty. It was absence of participation in a narrative that no longer required her permission. Alexander Reed remained still beside her, his presence steady, not intervening, not correcting, simply existing as confirmation of a reality Daniel was struggling to integrate. Daniel shifted his attention back to Alexander, attempting to regain structure through formal address. If what you are saying is accurate, Daniel said, then there would have been legal disclosures, filings, or at minimum institutional visibility. A consolidation of that magnitude cannot exist without documentation at multiple regulatory levels. Alexander's expression remained unchanged. Documentation exists for systems that require validation through external observation, he replied. What you are describing is a system that still assumes it is being observed from the outside. The distinction was subtle, but it removed another layer of certainty from Daniel's stance. Around them, guests no longer pretended to be engaged in unrelated conversations. Every eye was now anchored to the exchange, as if the entire gala had shifted from social event to silent evaluation. Daniel inhaled slowly, trying to maintain composure. "Then clarify," he said. "If Emily is connected to your network in the way you are implying, what exactly is her position within it?" For the first time, Alexander did not respond immediately. Instead, he turned his head slightly toward Emily, not as if seeking permission, but as if acknowledging alignment. Emily's gaze remained steady. There was no need for visible affirmation between them, only recognition that the moment had reached its intended threshold. Alexander turned back to Daniel. "Her position," he said calmly, "is not defined by access. It is defined by authorship." The word landed without force, but it disrupted the structure Daniel had been relying on. "Authorship," Daniel repeated, his voice lower now, less controlled. Alexander nodded once. "Every system you have referenced tonight, every institution you have depended on for operational continuity, operates within frameworks that were not only influenced, but originally structured through decisions she approved." A pause followed, longer than before. Daniel's expression did not immediately break, but something in his posture loosened, not physically but internally, as if the architecture of his confidence had lost its central support. "That is not possible," Daniel said, though the words lacked conviction. "Emily was never in a position to influence financial infrastructure at that level. I would have known." Emily finally spoke again, her voice calm, almost reflective. "You would have known what was visible to you," she said. The simplicity of the statement removed the need for elaboration. Daniel looked at her more directly now, searching for contradiction, for familiarity, for any trace of the version of events he had constructed over time. He found none. Alexander stepped slightly to the side, allowing the implication to settle without interruption. "Influence is often mistaken for visibility," he said. "The absence of recognition does not indicate absence of presence." Daniel exhaled slowly, his earlier attempts at control now replaced by measured silence. For the first time, he did not attempt to respond immediately. The room itself felt different now, no longer an audience but a witness to recalibration. Emily remained composed, her expression unchanged, but there was a quiet certainty in her stillness that contrasted sharply with Daniel's unraveling internal structure. Alexander's voice lowered slightly, not in intensity, but in finality. "You entered this conversation believing hierarchy was defined by appearance," he said. "But hierarchy is defined by origin of control." Daniel did not speak. The realization did not arrive as a dramatic collapse. It arrived as absence. Absence of certainty. Absence of reference. Absence of the framework he had used to define every interaction in the room. And in that absence, Emily Carter stood not as someone being revealed, but as someone who had never needed to be introduced at all. Daniel Whitmore did not speak immediately. The absence of words was no longer strategic. It was reactive. His earlier confidence, built on repetition and social reinforcement, no longer had a stable foundation in the environment he stood in. Around him, the gala felt different now, as if the architecture of the room itself had shifted from celebration to observation. He finally exhaled, attempting to reassert control through composure. "This is a very significant claim," Daniel said carefully, his voice lower than before. "If what you are stating is true, it would imply that my entire operational framework has been interacting with systems far beyond standard disclosure." Alexander Reed remained calm, his posture unchanged. "You are only now recognizing the scale of what you have been interacting with," he said. The sentence was not delivered as accusation, but as clarification. Daniel looked briefly around the room, searching for support, validation, or even confusion from others, but found only silence and attention. The guests were no longer reacting as participants in a social event. They were witnessing recalibration. Daniel turned back to Alexander. "Even if there is external influence at the level you describe," he said, carefully choosing each word, "there would still be layers of independent governance. No single point of origin could maintain uninterrupted control across multiple sectors without exposure." Alexander's expression remained steady. You are still describing systems that assume separation between appearance and function, he replied. That assumption is incorrect. A pause followed, heavier than before. Daniel's gaze shifted again briefly toward Emily Carter. For the first time, his expression toward her was no longer dismissive or confident. It carried uncertainty that he had not yet fully named. Emily, he said slowly, if any of this is accurate, then you were not simply involved after our separation. You were operating within this structure long before it. Emily did not respond immediately. Her silence was not hesitation. It was distance from the emotional framing of the question. When she finally spoke, her voice remained calm. You are trying to place time around something that was never defined by your timeline, she said. Daniel frowned slightly, struggling to process the implication. That does not answer the question, he replied. Alexander stepped forward just enough to re-enter the center of attention without raising his voice. The question you are asking assumes sequential access, he said. It assumes there was a beginning where you were aware of her position. That assumption is incorrect. Daniel's breathing slowed, not in relaxation, but in concentration. Then explain, he said. What exactly is her position now, if not what I understood it to be during our marriage? Alexander's answer was immediate. Her position has never changed, he said. Only your perception of it did. The words settled across the room with quiet finality. Daniel's expression tightened, not in anger, but in the strain of internal restructuring. The narrative he had maintained for years was no longer aligning with the information present in front of him. Emily finally turned her gaze fully toward him. There was no hostility in her expression. There was no satisfaction. There was only clarity that did not require acknowledgement from anyone else. You built your understanding of me, she said calmly, within limits that were convenient to you. Daniel attempted to respond, but the words did not form immediately. Around them, the gala no longer resembled the environment it had begun as. Conversations had dissolved entirely. Even movement felt reduced, as if everyone present understood that interruption would diminish the significance of what was unfolding. Alexander's voice lowered slightly, not in volume but in resolution. There are systems that operate without requiring recognition from those who benefit from them, he said. And there are individuals who assume absence of recognition equates to absence of existence. Daniel finally looked down for a brief moment, not in defeat, but in recalibration. When he looked up again, his expression was no longer confident, no longer performative. It was uncertain in a way that had no immediate resolution. Emily remained still, unchanged, while the space around her seemed to reorganize its understanding of where authority had always been anchored. And for the first time, Daniel Whitmore understood that the conversation he thought he was leading had ended long before he began speaking. Daniel Whitmore remained silent longer than before, not because he had chosen silence, but because each possible response now carried instability he could no longer predict. The gala around him had become something unrecognizable, not louder or more chaotic but clearer, as if every layer of illusion had been peeled away one by one. He finally lifted his gaze again, forcing his voice into steadiness. If what has been said is accurate, Daniel began carefully, then the implications extend far beyond personal misunderstanding. This would involve systemic control at levels that should be publicly traceable through institutional records. Alexander Reed did not move. His presence remained unchanged, grounded in certainty that did not require reinforcement. You are still referencing systems that depend on public traceability, he said calmly. That is not how structural control operates at its highest level. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, not in defiance but in strain. Then what you are describing, he replied, would require absolute concealment across financial, legal and operational networks simultaneously. That level of coordination is not feasible without exposure over time. A faint pause followed. Alexander's gaze remained steady. Exposure assumes opposition with equal access to visibility, he said. That condition does not exist in the framework you are attempting to describe. The silence that followed was heavier than before, not because it was uncomfortable but because it was complete. Daniel turned his head slightly, once again toward Emily Carter, as if attempting to locate the beginning of something he had previously ignored. Emily, he said, his voice less controlled now. If this is true, then your entire position during our marriage was not what I believed it to be. Emily did not respond immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice carried no emotional fluctuation, only precision. Your belief was never the foundation of my position, she said. Daniel exhaled slowly, as if trying to release pressure that no longer had an outlet. Then explain what I was to you, he asked. If none of what I understood was accurate, then what role did I actually have in this? Emily looked at him directly, and for the first time that evening, there was something final in her stillness. You were part of a life you observed, she said calmly, not one you defined. The words did not carry hostility, yet they removed every remaining assumption Daniel had been standing on. Around them, the gala no longer functioned as a social gathering. It had become a silent structure of attention, with every guest positioned as witness rather than participant. Alexander stepped slightly forward again, not interrupting, but continuing the inevitability of the moment. There are individuals, he said, who believe proximity equates to understanding. They assume that shared time creates shared awareness of structure. That assumption is consistently incorrect. Daniel's expression shifted again, subtle but irreversible. The confidence that had once defined his presence was no longer present in any recoverable form. So what you are saying, Daniel replied slowly, is that everything I believed about my position, my influence, and my stability was incomplete. Alexander nodded once. Incomplete is a restrained interpretation, he said. A quiet tension settled over the room, not from conflict, but from realization without resolution. Daniel looked down briefly, not in surrender, but in the absence of remaining reference points. When he lifted his gaze again, it was no longer directed at control, but at comprehension. Emily remained unchanged, her composure uninterrupted by the collapse of assumptions surrounding her. And in that stillness, the structure of Daniel Whitmore's certainty finally reached its limit, not through confrontation, but through clarity he could no longer reinterpret. Daniel Whitmore stood in a silence that no longer felt like pause but like removal. The environment around him remained unchanged in appearance, yet every layer of certainty he once relied on had already dissolved into something he could not reconstruct through logic alone. He finally spoke again, but his voice carried a different weight now, less performance and more search for grounding. If what I am understanding is correct, Daniel said slowly, then my entire framework of business operations, partnerships, and financial alignment has been dependent on systems I never directly interacted with or controlled. Alexander Reed observed him without interruption. His expression remained steady, not reactive, as if the conclusion Daniel was reaching had already been accounted for long before this moment. You are beginning to describe dependency without prior awareness of dependency, Alexander said calmly. Daniel exhaled, his gaze lowering briefly before returning. That would mean every expansion, every acquisition, every negotiation I believed I was leading was influenced by variables outside my visibility. Alexander nodded once. Influence does not require visibility to exist, he replied. The words settled into the space between them with quiet finality. Daniel's shoulders tightened slightly, not in resistance, but in the strain of reinterpreting an entire professional identity in real time. He turned again toward Emily Carter, as if the remaining structure of his understanding might still be anchored there. Emily, he said, his tone noticeably softer now, during our marriage you never indicated involvement in anything at this level. There was nothing that suggested. He paused, as if realizing the sentence itself no longer had a stable endpoint. Emily's gaze remained steady, her expression unchanged. When she spoke, her voice was calm, measured, and free of emotional escalation. There was no reason for you to see what you were not responsible for understanding, she said. Daniel blinked once, slowly, absorbing the implication without immediately responding. Around them, the gala no longer functioned as a background environment. It had become a shared point of focus, where even the smallest movement felt amplified by silence. Daniel tried again, though his tone had lost its earlier structure. Then what was I to you in that time? He asked. If not someone aware of the reality you are describing now? Emily regarded him for a moment, not with distance, but with clarity that required no emotional framing. You were part of a life that operated independently of your interpretation of it, she said. The simplicity of the statement removed the need for elaboration. Daniel's expression tightened briefly, then softened into something closer to reflection than confrontation. Alexander stepped forward slightly, his presence reasserting itself not through volume, but through inevitability. There is a consistent misunderstanding among individuals who operate within visible hierarchies, he said. They assume proximity to outcome equates to comprehension of structure. Daniel listened without interruption now. What you are experiencing, Alexander continued, is the recognition that outcomes can be influenced without ever being directly attributed to the source of that influence. The words did not carry accusation. They carried explanation without comfort. Daniel looked down briefly, then back up again, his voice quieter. So everything I believed about my position within the market, he said slowly, was never isolated as I thought it was. Alexander's response was immediate, but calm. Isolation was never part of the structure you were operating within, he said. A long silence followed. Daniel no longer attempted to assert control over the conversation. Instead, he remained still, processing not collapse but redefinition. Emily stood unchanged, her presence no longer requiring recognition to remain central. The room itself seemed to reflect that shift, as if the hierarchy it had unconsciously accepted had been quietly rewritten. Daniel finally spoke again, but without expectation of correction or confirmation. Then my understanding was not simply incomplete, he said. Alexander did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was steady. It was localized, he said. That single word settled into the space with finality that required no further elaboration. And in that moment, Daniel Whitmore no longer stood at the center of anything he thought he controlled, but at the edge of a structure that had never been designed around him. The silence that followed Alexander Reed's final statement was no longer heavy with tension, but with resolution. Daniel Whitmore stood still, not because he was waiting for another explanation, but because he was no longer certain what question he was supposed to ask next. The structure of his understanding had shifted beyond repair, not through confrontation, but through gradual exposure to something he had never accounted for. He finally spoke, though his voice lacked its earlier certainty. If everything you have described is accurate, Daniel said slowly, then my role in the systems I operated within was never foundational. It was derivative. Alexander Reed observed him without interruption. There was no correction, only confirmation in his stillness. Daniel continued, searching for coherence. That would mean my decisions were always occurring within boundaries I did not establish, influenced by frameworks I did not design, and stabilized by mechanisms I did not control. Alexander nodded once. That is a precise articulation of dependency within unseen architecture, he said calmly. Daniel exhaled, his gaze lowering briefly before returning to Emily Carter. The need to recontextualize her presence had become unavoidable, not emotionally but structurally. Then explain your position in this, Daniel said quietly. Not as a conclusion but as a beginning. If I never had visibility into your actual role, then what was the nature of our shared time? Emily did not respond immediately. When she finally spoke, her tone carried no resistance, only clarity. Your interpretation of shared time does not define shared structure, she said. The words were simple, yet they displaced every assumption Daniel had used to anchor his understanding of their past. Around them, the gala no longer functioned as a gathering. It had become a point of convergence, where every presence in the room was now witnessing the same recalibration of hierarchy. Alexander stepped slightly forward again, not to dominate the space, but to finalize its understanding. There is a recurring pattern in systems built on partial visibility, he said. Participants assume continuity of influence based on proximity, when in reality, influence is distributed through layers they never directly engage with. Daniel listened without interruption. For the first time, he was no longer attempting to respond immediately. Instead, he was absorbing structure rather than resisting it. You are describing, Daniel said slowly, a system in which participation does not guarantee comprehension. Alexander replied without hesitation. Correct. The simplicity of the answer removed any remaining ambiguity. Daniel stood motionless for a moment, his gaze unfocused, not from confusion alone, but from the absence of a stable framework to replace what had been dismantled. Emily remained composed, her presence unchanged, yet no longer interpretable through the lens Daniel had once used. "Then what remains?" Daniel asked quietly. "Of the position I believed I held?" Alexander paused briefly before responding. "What remains is observation without authority over interpretation," he said. The statement did not carry judgment. It carried finality. Daniel's expression shifted subtly, not into defeat, but into a form of recognition that lacked emotional resolution. He looked around the room once more. The guests were still, not because they were instructed to be, but because the moment itself had removed the need for reaction. Emily finally spoke again, her voice steady. "You are trying to reconstruct meaning from a system that was never dependent on your reconstruction," she said. Daniel absorbed the words without interruption. There was no longer resistance in his posture, only the quiet acknowledgement that the structure he had relied on had never been as contained as he believed. Alexander's voice softened slightly, not in emotion but in closure. "Understanding does not always arrive with comfort," he said. "Sometimes it arrives after the assumption of control has already been removed." Daniel did not respond. He simply stood in the realization that every assumption he had built his identity upon within that space had been external to his actual position. And for the first time he understood not the loss of power, but the absence of ownership over the narrative he had believed he was living. The moment lingered in a suspended stillness that no one in the Manhattan Grand Regency Hotel attempted to interrupt. Daniel Whitmore remained at the center of it, not by position but by circumstance, as if the space around him had stopped acknowledging the structure he once represented. He finally spoke again, though his voice no longer carried expectation of correction or validation. "Then what I am left with," Daniel said slowly, "is the realization that every interpretation I built around my achievements was dependent on systems that were not transparent to me at the time." Alexander Reed observed him without movement. "That is a transitional stage of understanding," he replied calmly. Daniel nodded faintly, as if acknowledging a process rather than a conclusion. "Then my perception of leadership, success, and autonomy was not defined by isolation of effort, but by interaction with frameworks I did not identify as external influence." Alexander did not respond immediately. The silence between them was no longer tension. It was completion without declaration. Emily Carter stood unchanged, her presence steady, her attention now fully aligned with the shift that had taken place in Daniel's understanding. There was no need for her to assert anything further. The structure had already adjusted itself around recognition rather than explanation. Daniel turned slightly toward her again, but this time without the earlier search for contradiction. "If that is the case," he said quietly, "then my entire understanding of what I thought I shared with you was filtered through limitations I never questioned." Emily met his gaze directly. Her expression remained composed, without emphasis or emotional framing. "You did not fail to understand," she said. "You understood within the boundaries you chose to accept as complete." The simplicity of the statement removed any remaining attempt at reinterpretation. Daniel exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering slightly, not in defeat, but in absence of resistance. Around them, the guests remained silent, not because they were instructed, but because the moment no longer invited interpretation from outside its own logic. Alexander stepped forward again, his presence steady, his voice unchanged in tone. "There is a final stage in structural recognition," he said. "It occurs when individuals stop attempting to reconcile their previous assumptions with current reality, and instead begin to accept that those assumptions were never operating in full context." Daniel listened without interruption. His expression no longer sought resolution through argument. It had transitioned into observation. "Then what remains?" Daniel asked slowly. "Of my position within everything I believed I was part of?" Alexander replied without delay. "What remains is awareness of participation without authorship of structure," he said. The words settled into the space with quiet inevitability. Daniel looked down briefly, then back up, his voice no longer carrying urgency. "So even my influence," he said, "was always relative, not foundational." Alexander nodded once. "All influence is relative to architecture," he said. Emily remained still, her presence no longer requiring explanation or context. She was not a revelation within the room. She was the point at which all prior interpretations had been recalibrated. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, then spoke with measured calm. Then my understanding of your role in my life was never aligned with the actual structure you were operating within. Emily responded without hesitation. Your understanding was aligned with what you were able to perceive at that time, she said. Nothing more. The finality of her words did not close the conversation. It removed the necessity for continuation. Alexander's voice softened slightly, not in emotional tone, but in structural closure. At this point, he said, further explanation does not expand understanding. It only restates what has already been revealed. Daniel did not respond. He remained still, no longer attempting to reconstruct meaning from fragments of previous assumptions. The room around him no longer functioned as a stage for interaction, but as a fixed point of realization. And in that realization, Daniel Whitmore understood that what had shifted was not his position within the room, but his understanding of how positions themselves had always been defined. The silence inside the Manhattan Grand Regency Hotel no longer felt like an interruption in time. It felt like the final stabilization of something that had already completed its internal shift. Daniel Whitmore stood at the center of it, no longer searching for explanation, but observing the absence of necessity for one. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a calm that was different from anything he had used before. Then what I am understanding now, Daniel said slowly, is that my entire framework of success was not constructed in isolation, but through systems of influence that existed beyond my direct recognition. Alexander Reed remained still. That is an accurate reconstruction of your current awareness, he said. Daniel nodded faintly, not in agreement or disagreement, but in recognition that the statement no longer required resistance. Then my perception of leadership, Daniel continued, was always dependent on structures that defined boundaries of influence before I ever interacted with them directly. Alexander did not respond immediately. The pause carried no tension. It carried completion. Emily Carter stood unchanged, her presence no longer interpreted through past frameworks, but observed as a fixed point of clarity within a restructured understanding. Daniel turned toward her once more, but this time without searching for contradiction or reversal. Then what I believed I knew about our shared history, he said quietly, was shaped entirely within my own limitations of perception at the time. Emily met his gaze. Her voice remained steady without emphasis or emotional framing. Your understanding was consistent with your position within that moment, she said. It did not extend beyond it. The simplicity of the response eliminated any remaining effort to reinterpret the past as something misjudged or corrected. It was instead understood as bounded. Daniel exhaled slowly, his posture steady, but no longer anchored to the need for internal justification. Around them, the room remained silent, not as reaction, but as confirmation that the event had already passed the threshold of debate. Alexander stepped slightly forward, his tone unchanged, but now carrying the final layer of articulation. At this stage, he said, the distinction between perceived influence and actual structure becomes less about correction and more about acceptance of scale. Daniel listened without interruption. He no longer attempted to rebuild his identity through comparison. Then what remains of my interpretation of my own role? Daniel asked slowly. If every outcome I attributed to individual control was part of a larger framework I did not define? Alexander responded immediately. What remains is participation within structure without authorship of its design, he said. The words did not land as revelation. They landed as confirmation of something already fully exposed. Daniel stood still for a moment, absorbing not shock, but final alignment between perception and reality. He looked briefly around the room, then back to Emily. Then my understanding of your position, he said, was never capable of capturing the full context of what you were actually operating within. Emily did not move. Your understanding was complete within its own constraints, she said. It was never required to extend beyond them. There was no correction in her tone, only definition. Alexander's voice softened slightly, not in emotion, but in closure of structure. At this point, he said, All remaining interpretation is repetition of what has already been established. Daniel did not respond. He no longer needed to. The realization had fully completed its internal cycle. The environment around him was no longer something to interpret, negotiate, or challenge. It was simply structure, existing independent of his previous assumptions about his place within it. And in that silence, Daniel Whitmore understood not a loss of position, but the absence of ever having been the center of the system he once believed he controlled. The silence that followed had no further demand for interpretation. It was no longer a moment waiting to be resolved, but a moment that had already completed its function. Daniel Whitmore remained still, not because he was uncertain, but because there was nothing left in the structure around him that required response in the way he once understood response. When he finally spoke, his voice carried no trace of resistance or attempt to regain position. "Then what remains," Daniel said slowly, "is the understanding that everything I attributed to independent control was always operating within systems that existed prior to my awareness of them." Alexander Reed did not move. "That is the final stage of structural recognition," he said calmly. Daniel nodded once, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement that no further refinement of language would alter the conclusion already reached. "Then my perception of achievement," Daniel continued, "was never isolated from external architecture, even when it appeared to be internally generated." Alexander replied without hesitation. "Correct." The word landed without weight because weight was no longer necessary. Emily Carter stood unchanged, but her presence now functioned differently in Daniel's awareness. She was no longer interpreted as part of a personal narrative, but as a point within a system he had only partially perceived. Daniel turned toward her, not searching for explanation, but for closure of perspective. "Then what I believed about our history," he said quietly, "was constructed entirely within the limitations of my own awareness at the time." Emily's voice remained steady, without emotional framing. "Your understanding was not incorrect," she said. "It was complete within the boundaries of your position." There was no contradiction in her statement, only definition. Daniel exhaled slowly. His shoulders relaxed in a way that no longer suggested tension or release, but acceptance of final structure. Around them, the Manhattan Grand Regency Hotel no longer felt like a place of social hierarchy or professional confrontation. It had become a fixed point of realization where interpretation itself had reached its limit. Alexander stepped forward slightly, his tone unchanged, but now carrying the final articulation of the entire exchange. "There is no additional layer required beyond this point," he said. "What has been revealed is sufficient to redefine all prior assumptions." Daniel listened without interruption. There was no longer a need to respond in order to maintain coherence. He looked briefly across the room, observing not individuals, but the absence of the frameworks he once used to categorize them. "Then what remains of my position?" Daniel asked calmly. "If the structures I believed I influenced were never contained within my direct control?" Alexander answered immediately. "What remains is participation without origin of design," he said. The phrase did not create confusion, completed it. Daniel stood in silence for several seconds, not processing new information, but settling into the absence of need for further reconstruction. He finally spoke one last time, his voice even and clear. "Then there is nothing left to correct," he said. Alexander gave a single quiet nod. "There is only recognition," he replied. Emily did not move, but her presence no longer carried the weight of personal history in Daniel's perception. It had become part of a larger system that existed independently of his interpretation of it. The room remained still, not because it was forced to, but because there was nothing within it left unresolved. Daniel Whitmore no longer stood within a narrative of control or loss of control. He stood within understanding that control had never been the defining condition of the structure he had once believed he led. And in that final recognition, the distinction between participant and author dissolved completely, leaving only awareness of the system as it had always been.